In April 1199, King Philip II of France reportedly thanked God when he heard that his great rival had perished. The mighty Richard the Lionheart, famed for his exploits on crusade and his ferocity in war, met a fate that many chroniclers found surprisingly anticlimactic. Far from falling in a grand battle, Richard was mortally wounded during a minor siege in rural France. In early 1199, Richard was in France reclaiming lands seized by Philip during his absence on the Third Crusade and subsequent captivity. By March, his campaign brought him to the Limousin region of Aquitaine, where a local uprising demanded the king's attention. A vassal of Richard's, the Viscount of Limoges, had rebelled, so Richard moved to crush the revolt, laying siege to a small castle called Chalus-Chabrol. This was a tiny, lightly defended fortress. Later accounts even called it virtually unarmed, hardly a challenge for a veteran crusader king. Why Richard bothered personally leading his forces at this siege has become a point of debate over the centuries. According to some chroniclers, a local peasant had recently unearthed a treasure trove of Roman gold, and the greedy king demanded the loot as his right. When the castle's lord refused, Richard besieged the stronghold in pursuit of the newly unearthed wealth. Other historians, however, argue that Richard was simply securing control of this strategic area and punishing a rebellious vassal, with the treasure story likely a later embellishment. Either way, by late March 1199, Richard found himself fully invested in the siege of a minor castle, expecting an easy victory. Little did he know this minor siege would become one of the most important events in medieval history. Legend holds that Richard, ever bold, grew careless during the siege. On the evening of March 26, 1199, the king took a relaxed walk around the castle walls without donning his chainmail armor. He was surveying the defenses up close, accompanied by a mercenary captain, and not expecting any serious danger. The siege was nearly won. The garrison was small, and Richard treated it almost like a casual outing. At that moment, the history of England, France, and Europe as a whole would change forever. A defender on the ramparts loosed a crossbow, and the bolt caught Richard in his left shoulder, near the neck. The king staggered back, the missile lodged deep. One colorful account even claims the crossbowman used a frying pan as a makeshift shield while taking the shot, underscoring the improvised nature of the castle's defense. Richard and his men at first shrugged off the wound. After all, it seemed a minor injury and not life-threatening. The king had survived countless battles and injuries. By some reports, he even joked about the crossbow hit. He was, after all, a true warrior king, the kind that wouldn't be seen for much longer, and he couldn't show weakness. Confident, he had the bolt removed and continued directing the assault on the lightly defended castle. Within a day or two, the castle fell to Richard's forces, essentially resolving the minor siege. But Richard's own ordeal had only just begun. What initially looked like a superficial wound soon turned into something much worse. Medieval medicine being what it was, the injury to Richard's shoulder became infected in the days after the castle's capture. The wound darkened and festered, and those around the king realized that gangrene had set in. In an age without antibiotics, such an infection in that area of his body was almost a guaranteed death sentence. The once invincible Lionheart watched as his strength ebbed. Over the next 10 days, Richard's condition worsened steadily. The king, who was only 41 years old, now understood the wound was mortal and began to settle his affairs. From his camp at Chalus, Richard sent word to his mother, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, who rushed to be by his side. In the early evening of April 6th, 1199, King Richard perished. The mighty warrior king who had been feared and respected throughout Europe and the Middle East alike was felled by a common infection in a remote corner of France. According to chronicle accounts, Richard remained lucid to the end despite his pain. It's said that as he lay dying, he expressed regret for his past misdeeds and cruelties while on campaign. In a customary medieval gesture, Richard's body was divided for burial. His entrails were interred at the foot of the walls of Chalus, which some view as a token of contempt for the revolt there. His heart was sent to Rouen Cathedral in Normandy, and the rest of his body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou at the feet of his father's tomb. One of the most dramatic subplots of Richard's death involves the very man who fired the fatal bolt. Who was this crossbowman, and what became of him? The chronicles offer slightly different versions. With Chalus Castle taken and Richard now dying, the king ordered that the sniper responsible be found and brought before him. Contemporary sources variously name the culprit as Pierre Bazile, Jean Sabroz, or even Bertrand de Gourdon. Several accounts agree he was just a youth who had taken a lucky shot from the walls. Though all accounts agree that he was young, his specific age varies wildly. As the story goes, the captive was dragged before the ailing king, defiant but scared. In one telling, the young crossbowman confessed that he had acted out of revenge, shouting that Richard had slain his father and 2 brothers. He fully expected to be executed on the spot for striking down the Lionheart. What followed next became the stuff of legend. Summoning the last of his strength, King Richard didn't seek vengeance on his attacker. Instead, he chose the path of mercy, and before a gathering of his knights, Richard forgave the crossbowman for the deed. According to this account, he even gifted him a large sum of money to move on with his life. It was an extraordinary act of clemency from a king known for his ruthless temper. Richard perhaps saw it as a final chivalric deed, a way to leave the world honorably and atone for past sins. However, this wouldn't be a medieval tale without a dark twist. Richard's generous pardon was immediately undermined after his death. No sooner had the Lionheart drawn his last breath than his loyal retainers sought revenge on the man who caused it. According to some, it was his knights themselves who did it, to preserve the king's honor. In other accounts, it was Richard's fearsome mercenaries, who were eager to get their hands on the wealth that had been bestowed to the youth. Whatever the case, it appears that despite Richard's uncharacteristic act of clemency, the crossbowman didn't escape his fate. In the aftermath of 1199, Richard the Lionheart's death quickly took on symbolic significance. To his enemies, it was divine justice. Philip of France rejoiced, seeing providence in the fall of his most dangerous foe. To his admirers, it was a tragic, almost storybook end. One chronicle mournfully observed that the lion was slain by the ant, encapsulating the irony that a great warrior king was slain by a lucky crossbow bolt. Indeed, the contrast was dramatic. Richard had survived pitched battles, crusades, and captivity, only to be done in by a minor wound from a common soldier. This sense of the mighty, brought low by the trivial, made Richard's death a popular tale for storytellers in subsequent centuries. Over time, embellishments and theories sprouted around the event. Some folk tales whispered that the arrow was poisoned to explain how such a formidable warrior succumbed to a single hit. Speculation ran rampant that the French king may have played his part in this underhanded act, though modern scholars have found no evidence of this. Medical analysis today indicates Richard died of sepsis from the gangrenous wound, not an exotic poison. The 12 days between his injury and death gave ample time for infection to spread in an era with no antibiotics, making the official cause, gangrene or blood poisoning, wholly believable. The idea of a poisoned bolt is viewed as a later romantic embellishment, unsupported by contemporary evidence. In truth, infection was a common killer in medieval warfare. A scratch could turn deadly without proper care, let alone a deep puncture wound. Richard's death, then, was not miraculous or mysterious, but a typical outcome for an untreated battlefield injury. The real mystery, perhaps, is why Richard was there at all, exposing himself to danger at a petty siege. Was it hubris? Overconfidence? Desperation for treasure? Historians continue to debate the king's mindset in those fateful moments. What is clear is that Richard's demise changed the course of history. His brother John inherited the throne, and the Plantagenet dominions soon began to unravel without the Lionheart's strong arm. And in case you doubt the history-altering effect of this one single crossbow bolt, remember that John signed the Magna Carta. Though this is speculation, I suspect that Richard the Lionheart, known for his fierce independence and military prowess, would have never signed the Magna Carta. His reign was defined by absolute power and unyielding authority, leaving little room for legal constraints. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Also be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. Elizabeth Bathory, a 17th century Hungarian countess, is enshrined in legend as one of history's most prolific monsters. The lurid tales surrounding her have made Bathory infamous as the Blood Countess. However, modern historical research paints a very different picture. Increasingly, scholars are disputing the traditional narrative and suggest that Bathory may have been the victim of a conspiracy. Under this theory, she was framed by powerful political and family rivals who stood to benefit from her downfall. Bathory lived in a time of intense turmoil in the Kingdom of Hungary. The early 1600s saw Hungary split into factions amid ongoing wars with the Ottoman Empire and the Counter-Reformation conflicts in Europe. Since the disastrous Battle of Mohacs in 1526, Hungary had effectively been divided into three parts. The western and northern regions were under Habsburg rule and were known as Royal Hungary. The central portion was under direct Ottoman occupation, and the eastern Principality of Transylvania, which was semi-autonomous. This meant that Hungarian politics were a high-stakes game involving the Catholic Habsburg Empire, the Protestant nobility of Transylvania, and the ever-present threat of the Ottomans. The Habsburgs were staunch Catholics intent on reimposing Catholicism, while many Hungarian nobles, including the Bathory family, were Protestant and resisted Habsburg religious control. In this climate, accusations and scandals could be weaponized to eliminate political opponents. At the time of Elizabeth Bathory's alleged crimes, her cousin György Thurzo was the Palatine of Hungary, the king's representative. King Matthias II, an Austrian Catholic Habsburg ruler, sat on the Hungarian throne. Both had vested interests in curbing the influence of powerful nobles in this unstable realm. Bathory's own nephew, Prince Gabriel Bathory, ruled Transylvania and was actively involved in Hungary's independence movement against Habsburg rule. Gabriel even eyed the Hungarian throne, a direct threat to King Matthias. As a Protestant with significant land holdings, Elizabeth Bathory was caught in the crosshairs of these power struggles. The Habsburg court had ample motive to discredit the Bathory family. Undermining Elizabeth's reputation would neutralize her political influence. Not only that, but it would also indirectly weaken her ambitious Transylvanian relatives. Indeed, contemporaneous records show that Matthias II had a very concrete incentive to move against her. The king owed Elizabeth an extremely large sum of money. Notably, after Bathory's arrest, that royal debt was conveniently cancelled. This suspicious detail suggests that eliminating Bathory was financially advantageous for the crown. Elizabeth Bathory was not an obscure figure to contemporaries. She was born into one of the most illustrious families of Central Europe. The Bathory family had been major players in Hungarian and Transylvanian history since the 13th century. Her lineage included numerous princes of Transylvania, though this was a small-time role compared to the status of her uncle. This uncle, Stephen Bathory, was the elected King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania from 1576 to 1586. Raised a Calvinist Protestant, young Elizabeth received an excellent education for a woman of her time and was noted to be intelligent and strong-willed. At age 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a member of another influential Hungarian dynasty. Nadasdy was a famed soldier celebrated for his battles against the Ottomans, earning the nickname the Black Knight of Hungary amongst his Turkish foes. Through this marriage, Elizabeth's social standing grew even higher, and the couple acquired a vast network of estates, including multiple castles, throughout Hungary. The couple controlled vast estates in Hungary, including the castle of Chaktice, which became Elizabeth's primary residence. They had several children together and lived in considerable wealth and privilege. When Ferenc Nadasdy died in 1604, Elizabeth became a widowed countess in her mid-40s, suddenly assuming sole control of the enormous combined estate. This made her one of the wealthiest landowners in Hungary. It was after her husband's death that dark rumors about Elizabeth's treatment of her servants began to spread more widely. Importantly, Bathory's status as a propertied widow also made her vulnerable. Her position was envied by other nobles, including her own kin. Indeed, there is evidence that some of Elizabeth's sons-in-law, who stood to inherit parts of her estate, were eager to control her lands and wealth. Thus, both the Habsburg authorities and elements of her extended family had something to gain from bringing Elizabeth Bathory down. The stage was set for what many historians now believe was a coordinated effort to remove the Countess and redistribute her riches under the guise of a criminal prosecution. The case against Elizabeth Bathory officially began in 1610, when complaints about the disappearance of young women in the area around Chaktice Castle could no longer be ignored. Locals whispered that peasant girls who went to work at the Countess's castle were never seen again. By late 1610, King Matthias II had ordered an investigation, which Palatine Georgi Thurzo undertook with zeal. According to the later trial records, Thurzo collected testimony from around 300 witnesses who alleged all manner of horrors. They told stories of girls being kidnapped or lured to the castle, then tortured by Bathory. Accounts spoke of beatings, burnings, and other even more ghastly tortures. When this evidence didn't prove convincing enough, these rumors grew to include even higher-born victims. Several minor noblewomen who had been entrusted to Bathory's care for etiquette training were said to have been eliminated by the Countess as well. It was this detail, that daughters of the gentry might have been among the victims, that finally prompted authorities to act decisively. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo raided Elizabeth's castle and arrested her along with 4 of her servants, who were alleged accomplices. A letter by Thurzo claims that upon arriving, he caught her red-handed, with her prey in the castle. In truth, however, this dramatic account appears to have been an embellishment for effect. Contemporary evidence indicates Bathory was actually having dinner when Thurzo arrived, not in the midst of torturing anyone. The quote-unquote prey girl found alive in the castle recovered from whatever had happened to her and never testified about any violations. Bathory herself was never given a trial, an extraordinary violation of the usual legal process, considering her rank. Thurzo and Bathory's relatives quickly agreed that she would be kept under house arrest, avoiding the spectacle of a public trial that could tarnish the noble family names. This also conveniently prevented Elizabeth from speaking in her own defense before any court. In early January 1611, 2 judicial proceedings were held to prosecute Bathory's servants. The servants, 2 older women, Dorothea Sentes and Ilona Yo, a younger woman, Katerina Benica, and a teenaged boy, Janos Uvari, were accused of being accomplices. Under torture themselves, these servants confessed to participating in the slayings of dozens of girls at Bathory's behest. The court found them guilty, and 3 were executed in a particularly brutal fashion. The 4th servant, Katerina, was spared execution and given life imprisonment, as the court believed she had been coerced by the others. Notably, I find this logic a little bit unusual. As if true, they were all asked to participate in these acts by the most powerful person in their world. Elizabeth Bathory, meanwhile, was simply kept locked in a set of rooms of her own castle. She would remain confined there for the rest of her life until her death in 1614. The evidence used to condemn Elizabeth Bathory has been a subject of growing skepticism. A close look reveals that the case was shockingly weak by modern standards, relying on hearsay, rumor, and coerced confessions. Although some 300 witnesses were interviewed, none of them claimed to have actually seen the Countess or her accomplices do anything. In fact, not a single alleged victim ever gave testimony. All the stories were second or third-hand accounts of what I heard happened at the castle. Many witnesses had been primed by local gossip before testifying. Some have suggested that Thurzo's men had spread the horrific rumors in each village to ensure everyone knew the narrative by the time they were questioned. Unsurprisingly, the testimonies were inconsistent, with different people citing wildly different numbers of victims. Some spoke of a dozen dead, others dozens or hundreds. The most sensational claim of all is that Elizabeth's body count was 650 individuals. This came from a witness who said that one of Bathory's estate administrators had seen such a number written in the Countess's private diary. Crucially, this mysterious diary was never produced as evidence, nor was its supposed witness able to confirm the story under oath. In short, the dramatic number of 650 victims was nothing more than unverified hearsay. By contrast, when Elizabeth's 4 servants were interrogated, the total number of victims they could come up with was 36. Furthermore, we have no record of any contemporaneous complaints or petitions from peasants regarding missing daughters or mistreatment by the Countess. In that era, it was common for villagers to send written complaints to the authorities even for minor offenses, so the absence of a paper trail alleging true evil is noteworthy. The picture that emerges is that the physical evidence of Bathory's guilt was scant. It was customary at the time for large estates to function partly as infirmaries. As a large landlord, Bathory was responsible for providing medical care to servants and tenants. Some of the quote-unquote torture described by witnesses may have actually been misunderstood accounts of primitive medical treatments like cauterization or bleeding sick patients. These procedures were gruesome by our standards, but were legitimate remedies for serious illness in the 17th century. It is easy to see how a superstitious witness, primed by terrifying rumors, might mistake a medical intervention on a dying plague victim for an act of torture. Ever since the 1980s, historians have revisited the Elizabeth Bathory case and cast doubt on the traditional accounts. What they have uncovered strongly suggests that Bathory was not a vampiric monster, but rather the target of a deliberate character assassination. As noted, King Matthias had obvious financial and political motives to remove Bathory, and he entrusted the task to Georgi Thurzo, who also stood to gain. The cooperation of Elizabeth's kin in her prosecution further hints at familial betrayal. Her 2 sons-in-law helped Thurzo quietly imprison her, likely angling to claim parts of her estate for themselves. Indeed, after Elizabeth was safely locked away, an agreement was reached to divide her vast lands among her family, ensuring the Habsburg crown couldn't seize everything. However, the Habsburgs did seize portions of the land and did succeed in breaking up the vast estates into smaller, easier controlled estates. Further, The Habsburgs drastically increased the land holdings of the Catholic nobility in Hungary and Transylvania to the detriment of the Protestant nobility. But let's get back to Elizabeth Bathory and discuss the most lurid claim against her. The most famous aspect of her story suggests that she preferred to bathe in the blood of virgins for the purpose of preserving her youth. This detail was first popularized in the 18th century by Jesuit writers over a century after Bathory's death as a sensational morality tale during the Counter-Reformation. Those later retellings were part of a broader effort to portray Protestant nobles as depraved, which further indicates how Bathory's story was co-opted for propaganda. Further, it was co-opted amongst those who believed that women shouldn't hold power in their own right, with the implication that Bathory resorted to sick acts to satisfy her vanity. In other words, the bloodbath legend is almost certainly fiction grafted onto her name long after she could defend herself. Notably, despite the extremely lurid accusations made against Bathory by Habsburg officials and in the trials of her accomplices, this detail was never even hinted at. Had there been any inkling of potential vampiric involvement, it stands to reason that the authorities would have brought this up in the trials. Today, the academic consensus is that Elizabeth Bathory's evil reputation far exceeds the probable reality of her life. While she may have been a harsh ruler, perhaps even guilty of inflicting punishment or cruelty on some servants, there's no reliable evidence for the most disturbing accusations against her. In late autumn of 1581, Russia's Tsar Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, became the central figure in one of the most infamous episodes in Russian history. According to long-standing accounts, Ivan flew into a violent rage and struck down his own eldest son and heir, mortally wounding him. The image of a grief-stricken father cradling his dying son has been seared into historical memory, not least through Ilya Repin's famous 1885 painting. Yet for centuries people have asked, did Ivan the Terrible really slay his son and heir? And if so, why? It's November 1581 at Ivan's residence in Alexandrov-Sloboda, a fortified compound north of Moscow. By this time, Ivan is in his early 50s, a hardened ruler scarred by decades of war and paranoia. His heir, his 27-year-old son, also named Ivan, had been groomed as the Tsarevich, crown prince, and was often at his father's side in matters of state and war. The tension between father and son, however, had been growing. Contemporary accounts hint that their relationship deteriorated during the later years of Ivan's reign, as the Tsar's temper became increasingly mercurial and outright violent. One Russian chronicler, Ivan Timofeyev, noted that quarrels between Ivan and his son were frequent and often turned physical. The Tsar's favorite weapon was a heavy staff designed to inflict pain, but not lethal blows. On November 14, 1851, an argument erupted that would quickly turn deadly. According to several sources, the dispute began when Ivan IV reprimanded his pregnant daughter-in-law Yelena, the Tsarevich's wife, for her attire. She had been resting in informal clothing when Ivan unexpectedly entered her chambers. Seeing her in undress, Ivan the Terrible became enraged at what he perceived as immodesty. In a fury, he struck the young woman very hard. One account by the papal envoy Antonio Passavino describes Ivan hitting his son's wife so brutally with his staff that she later miscarried. Hearing the commotion, Tsarevich Ivan rushed in to protect his pregnant wife. The son's intervention, however, only redirected Ivan's wrath. The Tsar turned on his heir, and in the heat of the altercation, Ivan raised his staff and brought it crashing down on the young man's head. The blow struck near the temple, knocking the Tsarevich to the ground and inflicting a terrible wound. In the immediate aftermath, the rage that possessed Ivan IV seemed to evaporate, replaced by instant remorse. Witnesses would later describe the Tsar cradling his bleeding son and falling into despair. Passavino, the papal envoy, noted in a report to Rome that, quote, having wounded his son, the father immediately gave himself up to deep grief. He frantically summoned doctors and advisors in a desperate attempt to save the Tsarevich's life. Despite these efforts, the young Ivan Ivanovich succumbed to his injury a few days later. Sources indicate the Tsarevich died on November 19, 1581, 5 days after the struggle. The story of Ivan the Terrible slaying his son comes mainly from contemporaries and near contemporaries who recorded the event. However, it's important to remember that the death of the Tsarevich is, in essence, not part of the direct historical record of the Muscovite state. Notably, the official Muscovite chronicles were largely silent about the cause of the Tsarevich's death. Immediately after the incident, Ivan IV attempted to control the narrative. He sent letters to trusted nobles reporting that his son had fallen gravely ill. He carefully worded the letters to avoid mentioning any altercation, and though he didn't state it directly, the letters strongly implied a natural illness was at work. Indeed, several official Russian chronicles dutifully noted the Tsarevich's death without providing details and certainly without blaming the Tsar. It's telling that none of the sanctioned chronicles suggest a violent cause. This silence was likely due to the unthinkable notion, at least publicly, that the Tsar, who was supposedly divinely ordained, could commit such an evil act. Beneath the surface, however, information leaked out. At least 6 different sources from the period mention the violent quarrel in November 1581 and implicate Ivan IV in his son's death. Ivan Timofeyev, a clerk close to the court, wrote the following. Quote, some say that the Tsarevich's life was extinguished by the blow of his father's hand because he wanted to keep his father from some disreputable deed. This some say phrasing suggests Timofeyev was reporting a rumor circulating in Moscow, likely the very truth that officials dared not state openly. Further, the wording is still very cautious, because the act that the Tsarevich was stopping was Ivan slaying his daughter-in-law and grandchild. Foreign observers in Russia provided more detailed testimony. Antonio Posavino, the Jesuit envoy from the Pope, arrived in Moscow in early 1582, just a few months after the tragedy. He found the Russian court deep in mourning for the Tsarevich. In his later published account, Posavino relates the entire grisly story as it was told to him by German Catholic merchants in Moscow. His version includes the scene of the pregnant daughter-in-law assaulted for her attire, and the son bludgeoned while pleading for mercy. Another foreign source, a French mercenary captain, wrote a few years later that the rumor in Moscow was that Ivan did it. The convergence of multiple testimonies all pointing to the same basic story is striking. By all indications, the Tsarevich was not simply terminally ill, as the official line claimed. Rather, he was fatally injured by his father. Despite the wealth of contemporaneous reports, it's important to acknowledge that not every historian has been completely convinced by the traditional story. The primary weakness in the evidence is the lack of any direct, first-hand documentation of the Tsar's guilt in official records. The most detailed account, Posavino's, was published a few years after the fact and was second-hand. In fact, Posavino's own private correspondence indicates he harbored doubts about the tale. Writing to his superiors in Rome, the Jesuit referred to the Tsarevich's death story as a rumor he didn't entirely believe. In other words, skeptics argue that the story might stem from hearsay amplified by Ivan's many enemies, both within Russia and in the West. Over the years, alternative theories have occasionally been floated. One suggestion is that the crown prince could have died of illness, or even been poisoned by political rivals, and that the tale of Ivan striking him was a later invention. However, Forensic inquiries have neither confirmed nor disproven such theories. In 1963, Soviet scientists exhumed the remains of the former heir to test the cause of death. Unfortunately, the Tsarevich's skull was too damaged by time and groundwater to yield conclusive evidence of a head injury. Traces of arsenic and mercury were found in the young man's bones, but only in small amounts. Some have suggested the possibility that this was from medicinal treatments, common at the time, not necessarily proof of deliberate poisoning. The forensic study thus didn't contradict the traditional account, rather it simply couldn't provide new proof either way. With physical evidence inconclusive and official chronicles mute, the case hinges on written testimonies and the circumstantial evidence of Ivan's subsequent behavior. Crucially, no credible source has ever presented a wholly different explanation for the Tsarevich's death. Yet the absence of this competent heir after November 1581 is an undeniable historical fact. All narratives, even the skeptical ones, must account for why the strong and healthy heir apparent died so suddenly in his father's residence. The simplest explanation remains the long accepted one, in essence, a disturbingly in character fit of rage on the Tsar's part. Indeed, historians have uncovered nothing that contradicts the belief that Ivan truly ended his son. The lack of definitive proof doesn't outweigh the convergence of contemporary hearsay that point to the Tsar's guilt. While I believe it's safe to say that based on the evidence we have today, he isn't guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, this isn't how we ought to judge historical cases such as this. Ivan the Terrible was, by all accounts, a man who was very violent on a personal level. While we should be careful with lurid anecdotes, in this case the anecdotes align with each other and with the Tsar's well-known character. Thus, even after considering the counter-arguments, the balance of evidence leans toward the conclusion that Ivan the Terrible did strike the blow that led to his son's death. Further, his subsequent actions were questionable if his son had perished of natural causes, a very common happening at that time. Evidence suggests that Ivan's remorse was not fleeting. More than a year after the incident, in January 1583, Ivan made a pilgrimage to the Trinity St. Sergius Monastery and met privately with two monks seeking spiritual counsel. According to monastery records, the Tsar arrived in despair, weeping and sobbing as he begged for forgiveness and for prayers for his departed son. He donated substantial sums of money and asked that his son be commemorated forever and ever at the monastery. Most have interpreted this as an extraordinary request that implies a deep sense of guilt. Notably, Ivan timed this act of penance to coincide with the Feast of Epiphany, when the Gospel reading calls for repentance. Historians interpret Ivan's behavior at the monastery as what is likely a genuine attempt at atonement. The Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, by most accounts, was a capable young man and one of the few people the cruel Tsar loved. For Ivan to fatally strike this son suggests that during his outburst, the Tsar's capacity for self-control was completely overwhelmed by rage. In the aftermath, faced with what he had done, Ivan's psyche must have been shattered. Some chronicles say that Ivan's health and spirit declined after his son's death. He became increasingly withdrawn and despondent in his final years. He died in 1584, less than 3 years after the incident, having reportedly never regained his vitality. The immediate personal tragedy of the Tsarevich's death had far-reaching consequences for the Russian state. The Crown Prince was not only Ivan IV's beloved son, he was the Tsar's only viable heir to the throne. By 1581, Ivan the Terrible had already lost 2 older sons in infancy and had 1 younger son, Fedor, who was widely regarded as weak and feeble-minded. In a moment of rage, Ivan effectively destroyed the future of his Rurikid dynasty. For reference, this is a dynasty so old and respected that they could trace their lineage all the way back to Viking Norse conquerors of the Russian frontier. Indeed, when Ivan the Terrible died a few years later, the throne passed to his surviving son, Tsar Fedor. Fedor, however, was an unprepared and ineffective ruler, and real power fell to Fedor's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, who acted as regent. When Fedor ultimately perished in 1598, Russia fell into a 15-year period called the Times of Trouble, where chaos overwhelmed Russia. And yes, you know when the Russians call it the Times of Trouble, it's real bad news. Thus, Ivan the Terrible's impulsive act of violence against his son set the stage for what became one of the most disturbing and destructive periods in Russian history. This period would only be ended by the ascension of the Romanov dynasty that would rule as autocrats of Russia for the next 3 centuries. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Also be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. On the morning of November 23, 1944, British anti-aircraft troops near Kortenberg in Belgium were startled to see a lone B-17 Flying Fortress bomber appearing out of the gray sky. It was heading straight toward them with its landing gear down, causing some concern amongst the British soldiers present. No flights were scheduled, so the soldiers on the ground assumed this heavy American aircraft must be in distress and attempting an emergency landing. The massive 4-engine bomber came in fast and low, overshooting their position and plowing into a nearby field. Its landing was rough and uncontrolled. The B-17's propeller blades snapped off as they struck the earth, and both wings smacked the ground before the fuselage skidded to a halt. Miraculously, the Flying Fortress did not break apart or burst into flames. It came to rest battered but largely intact, a crash landing in one piece, with 3 of its engines still faintly rumbling on. The astonished RAF crew braced for the bomber's crew to emerge, ready to help any survivors out of the wreck. They waited for over 15 minutes, expecting at any moment to see dazed airmen climbing out of the downed plane, but nobody came out. After some time passed with no apparent movement, Major John Crisp, one of the British officers on site, decided he had to investigate. Major Crisp cautiously approached the silent B-17, unsure what he would find inside. He even worried the abandoned bomber might be some kind of German booby trap or trick, given the unusual circumstance. The airplane's engines were still sputtering, so Crisp clambered onto the fuselage and managed to reach the controls to shut off the throbbing motors. With the roar of the engines dying out, an eerie silence fell. Crisp then found a hatch on the underside of the aircraft, opened it, and pulled himself up into the belly of the bomber. What he discovered upon entering would shock him. There was no one inside, not a single soul. The B-17's interior showed clear signs of recent occupation by a crew, yet the men themselves had vanished. To appreciate just how extraordinary this situation was, one must understand the typical role of a B-17 and its crew in World War II. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a heavy bomber employed by the United States Army Air Forces, used primarily in the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe. These stout aircraft, each usually manned by a crew of 10, flew from airfields in England on long-range missions to hit German military and industrial targets. They were capable of striking factories, railway yards, and oil refineries deep behind enemy lines, destroying the infrastructure of the crumbling Third Reich. B-17 crews endured fierce opposition on every sortie. Flying at high altitudes and tight formations, they were met with relentless anti-aircraft fire and increasingly limited swarms of enemy fighters. In the early years of the campaign, before long-range fighter escorts became common, American bomber losses were brutally high. In late 1943, the average B-17 had a life expectancy of only 11 missions, and its crew's odds were no better. Over the course of the war, these flying fortresses dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs on Axis targets, but this came at a great cost in men and machines. Some missions became infamous for their danger. For example, a single 1944 raid on the Mersburg-Leipzig oil complex was defended by 780 flak guns. In an astonishing fact, 56 American bombers were lost on that day alone. It wasn't uncommon for damaged bombers to limp back toward Allied lines, only to have their crews bail out when the aircraft could no longer stay aloft. Normally, however, if a crew had to abandon their B-17, the aircraft would eventually crash and be destroyed. None of the Allied soldiers in Belgium that day had ever seen a flying fortress make it back by itself, which is why the sight of that empty B-17 sitting in a field was so unbelievable. Inside the downed bomber, Major Crisp found plenty of evidence of its crew, but no crew members. Using a flashlight, he carefully moved through the fuselage and the cramped crew compartments. Later, Crisp would report that the most remarkable find was about a dozen parachutes wrapped up and ready to go. Every airman's parachute appeared to be present and packed, which made the absence of the crew even more baffling. If the men had jumped out, why were all their parachutes left on board? On the navigator's desk, Crisp found a code book and noted that the last entry scrawled in it read simply, "Bad flak." Scattered around were personal items, several fur-lined flying jackets, and even some half-eaten food. There were no signs of struggle or of any casualties. In fact, there was no blood and no damage from bullets or flak inside. Aside from the damage inflicted by the crash landing itself, the B-17 appeared surprisingly undamaged. This made the cryptic "bad flak" note even more puzzling, since whatever trouble the bomber had encountered in the air had left no visible holes or scars on the airframe. By this point, word of the strange crewless aircraft had spread among nearby Allied units. The abandoned flying fortress quickly earned a nickname, the Phantom Fortress. Investigators arrived to identify the ghost bomber and search for an explanation. They soon confirmed the plane's serial number and markings. It belonged to the 91st Bombardment Group, a veteran American unit based in England. The last mission flown by this B-17, before it decided to finish the trip alone, had been a raid on the oil refineries in Mersburg earlier that day. Somewhere between the target and Belgium, something clearly had gone very wrong. The pressing question remained: what happened to the crew? At first, some feared the men might have fallen out or met with a grim end. The untouched parachutes suggested that if anyone had bailed out during the flight, they did so without the very equipment that would have saved their lives. A breakthrough came not long after. Astonishingly, the entire crew was found alive and safe on the ground in Belgium. One by one, the American airmen from the Phantom Fortress were located and brought in by Allied personnel. Their appearance answered the biggest question. The men had parachuted out of the B-17 before it crash-landed, but raised others. According to their report, the B-17 had developed a serious mechanical problem with its bomb rack while en route to the target, which prevented them from dropping their bombs. The pilots veered the plane out of formation to try to resolve the issue, but as they did so, they were hit by enemy fire. Bursting flak from German anti-aircraft weapons further damaged the bomb bay and knocked out at least one of the engines. The flying fortress began losing speed and altitude, unable to stay with the rest of the bomber group. With a crippled engine and possibly structural damage, the pilot set his sights on Allied territory in Belgium. As they crossed into friendly territory not far from Brussels, the pilot gave the order to abandon the aircraft. Following standard procedure, the pilot engaged the autopilot to hold the plane steady on a level course while the crew prepared to jump. One by one, all the crewmen clipped on their parachutes and bailed out from the struggling fortress at an altitude of about 2,000 feet. They all made it out successfully and their parachutes deployed. The men drifted down to safety and were soon rescued by Allied ground units who spotted them. The B-17, now completely unattended, surprisingly did not nosedive or spiral out of control as many damaged planes would. Instead, with the autopilot still engaged, the bomber continued to fly on its own. It slowly descended in a wide glide, maintaining a generally straight and level altitude. In an incredible twist of fate, the unmanned aircraft happened to come down near where Major Crisp's anti-aircraft unit was positioned. When Major Crisp compared the crew's story to what he found, some details didn't seem to line up neatly. The airmen had described serious flak damage and engine failures, yet the aircraft on the ground showed little evidence of battle damage. Those discrepancies were not unheard of in the chaos of combat. More puzzling was the matter of the parachutes. Crisp had found all those chutes neatly stowed, but the crew obviously had parachuted out. One likely explanation is that the parachutes Crisp found were spares, or crew chute packs that were left on board. Perhaps the crew grabbed different chutes, such as chest pack parachutes that attached to harnesses, and left the rest behind in their haste. It's also conceivable that in the confusion, Crisp tallied more parachutes than were actually standard issue for the crew. Whatever the case, the presence of unused parachutes on the Phantom Fortress has remained one of the quirks of the story. The fact that this B-17 landed itself without a crew was unprecedented, and there's no documented cases of it happening since. Some question if the mystery isn't how the plane landed, or the state of the plane and the parachutes, but whether this event happened at all. In my review of the evidence, I think it may be best to classify this one as based on a true story. A flying fortress did land itself in November 1944, and the crew did survive. However, everything else may be subject to embellishments over time, or to make the story more compelling. That said, to repeat a tired line that's overused for a reason, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. The Crimean Goths were a fragment of an ancient Germanic people who somehow found an enduring refuge on the Crimean Peninsula from late antiquity to early modern times. While the Visigoth and Ostrogoth kingdoms rose and fell in Western Europe, the Goths of Crimea persisted for centuries in relative isolation. The Goths as a whole were an East Germanic people traditionally believed to have originated in Scandinavia before migrating southwards. By the 3rd century AD, Gothic tribes had moved down through Eastern Europe, reaching the shores of the Black Sea. In the mid-3rd century, these Gothic newcomers made their presence felt in Crimea. Substantial parts of the Crimean Peninsula fell under Gothic control, undermining Roman influence in the region. At that time, Crimea, known as Taurica, had been a mix of peoples, including Greeks and Scythians, under the Bosporan Kingdom and nominal Roman protection. The arrival of the Goths added a new Germanic element to this tapestry. They either conquered or gradually settled among the local populations, establishing themselves in the local geography. Early on, they would have interacted with the remaining Greco-Roman towns on the coast and the indigenous steppe tribes. This created a unique Crimean Gothic community at the crossroads of the Germanic, Greco-Roman, and steppe worlds. By the 4th century, the Crimean Goths were likely part of the vast Gothic realm ruled by the Ostrogothic king Ermanaric. According to a 6th century Eastern Roman historian, Ermanaric's Ostrogoths held a massive kingdom north of the Black Sea until the invasion of the nomadic Huns in the late 370s. While this account was written centuries later, it's believed to be based upon now lost primary sources, and archaeological evidence has provided corroborating evidence in modern times. The Huns' onslaught shattered the Gothic Empire. Ermanaric's dominion was destroyed, and many Goths were subjugated. Some Goths fled or were incorporated into the Hunnic horde, but others sought refuge in remote or defensible areas, and the Crimean Peninsula's rugged terrain provided one such haven. Thus, a branch of the Gothic people either remained in or retreated to Crimea when the Huns arrived, avoiding complete subjugation. These refugees and settlers became the Crimean Goths, known to later history. The Crimean Goths entrenched themselves especially deeply in the southern mountainous regions of Crimea. This area, with its natural fortifications and caves, would become their heartland, known in medieval times as Gothia. Archaeological evidence, from Germanic jewelry and weaponry to ruined ancient fortresses, still attests to their presence. One such stronghold was Doros, a defensible town in the mountains that later served as the Gothic capital. From these highlands, the Goths could sustain their community relatively insulated from the great powers that swept across the open steppes. In the late 4th and 5th centuries, after the collapse of Ermanaric's kingdom, the Crimean Goths lived under the shadow of larger events, but managed to maintain their distinct identity. The Ostrogoths, who had been subjugated by the Huns, eventually broke free after Attila's death in 453 and ended up moving west with other Germanic peoples. However, the Goths in Crimea never regained their former influence in the post-Hunnic era. Crimea was something of a backwater to the upheavals of the late Roman world, which may have helped the Gothic settlers there survive. By this time, the Western Roman Empire had fallen, but the Eastern Roman Empire remained a powerful presence in the Black Sea region. The Crimean Goths are thought to have had a complex relationship with Byzantium. They were distant from Constantinople, yet not entirely isolated. Trade and religion connected them. Many Goths had been converted to Christianity in the 4th century by the missionary Ulfilas, who created the Gothic alphabet. Emperor Justinian I is known to have reasserted power in parts of Crimea, strengthening Roman influence in coastal cities. It's likely that during this period, the Crimean Goths became formal allies or vassals of the empire, while still governing themselves in their upland enclaves. In essence, they existed as a fortified bulwark against the various steppe people who constantly harassed the Eastern Roman Empire. As the early Middle Ages unfolded, the Crimean Goths remained a small but tenacious nation. Throughout the early medieval period, the Crimean Goths had to navigate between powerful neighbors. To their east and north, the Eurasian steppe was controlled by the ruthless Khazar horse lords by the 7th and 8th centuries. The Khazars were a Turkic people who established a formidable empire and exerted influence over the peninsula. The Crimean Goths, living in the southwestern part of the peninsula, came under their overlordship, likely paying tribute while retaining local autonomy. Despite Khazar dominance, the Crimean Goths maintained their faith and culture. In the High Middle Ages, the Crimean Goths and their neighbors formed a small, independent state officially known as the Principality of Theodoro, sometimes called Gothia. Its population was diverse, including Crimean Goths alongside Greeks, Alans, Bulgars, Cumans, and others. The ruling house of Theodoro likely had Gothic roots, or at least claimed the legacy of the Gothic chiefs. The principality's official language and culture were heavily influenced by Byzantium, and Greek was used in official contexts. The state was closely allied with the Empire of Trebizond, a Byzantine Greek successor state on the Black Sea coast that broke off after the establishment of the Latin Empire. Yet the Gothic language and identity still persisted in the rural highlands. For over a century, Theodoro managed to hold its own. It was surrounded by powerful forces. The Golden Horde, and later the Crimean Khans, dominated the steppes, and Genoese merchant colonies dotted the coast. However, Theodoro leveraged its mountain defenses and alliances to survive. Theodoro was about to encounter a much more powerful state than they had ever been subjected to before. This state had conquered Constantinople and now claimed that they were the true successors of Rome, the Ottoman Empire. The Crimean Goths had an unbroken presence from late antiquity into the late medieval period as an independent or quasi-independent state. The end for the Gothic principality came with the expansion of the Turks. In 1475, Ottoman forces swept through Crimea, first conquering the Genoese ports, and then turned to the tiny principality of Theodoro. After a siege of Mangup, the Ottomans captured the last stronghold of the Crimean Goths in 1475, extinguishing the principality. Although 1475 marked the end of Crimean Gothic statehood, it did not immediately erase the people themselves. References to the Crimean Goths continued in the decades and even centuries that followed. Isolated mountain villages in Crimea evidently still harbored Gothic descendants, and the memory of their identity had not yet vanished. By the 16th century, European scholars and travelers had become aware of the Goths in Crimea as a curious remnant of antiquity. In fact, the existence of these Goths became almost legendary in Renaissance Europe, prompting adventurers and envoys to seek them out. One famous account comes from Ogier de Bousbecque, a Flemish diplomat who served as the Holy Roman Empire's ambassador to the Ottoman court in Constantinople in the 1550s. He was astonished to discover people whom he believed to be Goths still living in Crimea. In a letter, he described meeting men from Crimea who spoke a Germanic tongue. He wrote that the tribe was warlike and at the present day occupied numerous villages. He collected about 100 words of their language, which we now call Crimean Gothic. This diplomat was not alone, and other travelers echoed his observations. For example, a Silesian scholar claimed to have heard tale of a man who shipwrecked on the Crimean coast, who was able to speak some German with the locals. This latter account is largely believed to be exaggerated, but may in fact be based upon a true story of a sailor who found significant linguistic commonalities in a faraway land. However, as time went on, these Gothic communities gradually disappeared, and by the 18th century, accounts of people speaking the Gothic tongue grew scarce. The last known recorded observation of a Gothic people in Crimea comes from around 1780. The Archbishop of Mohilev visited the region and noted the existence of people whose language and customs differed greatly from their neighbors. Yet, after the late 18th century, no further reliable reports of a Gothic-speaking group in Crimea exist. Several factors contributed to the final disappearance of the Crimean Goths. Under Ottoman rule, the Gothic Christians of Crimea were a small minority among a Tatar majority and other groups like Armenians and Greeks. Over generations, most Gothic descendants either assimilated into the Crimean Tatars or merged into the Greek community. Later travelers in the region noted that the Crimean Tatars, found in the rugged regions on the south of the peninsula, bore a striking resemblance to Western and Northern European people. They were observed to exhibit characteristics that were extremely rare amongst Crimean Tatars, such as light hair and light eyes. This strongly suggests that after millennia of fierce independence, the last remnants of the Crimean Goths left their old traditions behind and blended in with their neighbors. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channels, Lazy Chill Zone and Lazy Chill True Crime. While the topic of the latter is obvious enough, Lazy Chill Zone deals with all sorts of unsolved mysteries. In the ancient Mediterranean world, Few plants were as celebrated or mysterious as silphium. This golden flowered herb was prized by Greeks and Romans alike. It was a coveted cure-all, used as a luxury spice by the rich and powerful, and was said to pitch a tent in your toga, if you catch my drift. Grown wild in a narrow coastal strip of North Africa near Cyrene, in modern Libya, silphium's economic importance was so great that its image was stamped on Cyrenian coins. Its resin, known to the Romans as laserpicium, was literally worth its weight in silver and gold, hoarded in imperial treasuries alongside precious metals. By the 1st century AD, however, this wonder plant had vanished, allegedly driven to extinction, with later Roman writers lamenting that only a single stalk was left to present to Nero. Silphium held an almost mythical status in the ancient Greek and Roman world. According to Greek legend, the god Apollo gifted silphium to humanity, a divine providence reflecting its medicinal value. The plant grew predominantly around the city of Cyrene, a Greek colony founded around 631 BC in North Africa, and it quickly became the lifeblood of Cyrene's economy. So central was silphium to Cyrene that most of the city's coins bore an image of the plant, depicting a thick stalk with frond-like leaves and umbrella-shaped clusters of flowers. Ancient Egyptians and Minoans knew of silphium as well. They even had a special hieroglyph or symbol to represent it, attesting to its fame across the Mediterranean. The plant's value was exorbitant. Roman writers noted it was generally traded pound for pound with silver. To put this in context, silver was the backbone of the Roman economy, and military pay, commercial transactions, and taxation were all dominated in silver, not gold. Further, Julius Caesar reportedly kept 1,500 pounds of silphium resin locked in the Roman treasury as a state treasure. Later, the Emperor Augustus is said to have demanded that all remaining stocks of silphium be sent to Rome, underscoring its strategic importance. What made silphium so precious was its diverse uses. In cuisine, its resin was a culinary sensation. Romans grated this spice onto all manner of dishes, from simple lentils to lavish roasted meats, much like we might use an intense garlic today. A Roman writer even offered tips on stretching one's silphium supply. He suggested storing pine nuts with a bit of silphium in a jar, so the nuts would absorb the flavor and could be crushed into recipes to impart the prized taste. Such anecdotes illustrate how deeply silphium was woven into food culture. It wasn't only a flavor, though. The whole plant was consumed. Ancient sources describe people eating silphium's thick stems as a vegetable and dipping its roots in vinegar for a tangy treat. They even fed silphium to livestock. Apparently, sheep and goats that grazed on it developed especially tender, delicious meat, making the herb doubly valuable for agriculture. Beyond the table, silphium was famed as a panacea in medicine. Physicians of antiquity prescribed it for an astonishing range of ailments, and one Roman author claimed it could remedy anything from stomach pain to warts. Perhaps most intriguingly, silphium garnered a reputation as a love drug, and men sought the plant to give them what I'll politely call male vitality. For all its fame, the exact botanical identity of silphium is a puzzle that has tantalized scholars for millennia now. Because silphium was harvested to extinction before modern taxonomy developed, we have no preserved specimens that can be definitively studied. Ancient descriptions, however, give us clues. Theophrastus, the Greek philosopher considered the father of botany, described silphium as having thick roots, a hollow stalk like fennel, and leaves like celery. In other words, it appeared to be an umbellifer, a member of the same plant family as parsley, carrots, and fennel. The plant's portrayal on surviving Cyrenian coins, with a branching stalk and umbrella-like flower clusters, reinforce this idea. Many botanists believe silphium was a type of giant fennel. The Roman geographer Strabo and others in antiquity thought that silphium was essentially a particularly potent variety of asafoetida, a spice derived from certain ferula species. Ferula are tall plants in the fennel family that grew in the Near East and were of great importance to Roman trade, particularly with Persia. In fact, when the real silphium started to become scarce, the Greeks and Romans resorted to using asafoetida as the next best thing in recipes. This is a substitution recorded by ancient writers and later noted by modern historians. While asafoetida was valued in its own right, Roman texts suggest it never quite matched the excellence of true silphium. This has led to the theory that silphium might have been a distinct species of ferula that was driven to extinction. How did a plant so valuable and beloved simply disappear? The extinction of silphium is often cited as one of the earliest recorded plant extinctions caused by human activity. Ancient authors were already puzzled by its scarcity. By the time of Emperor Nero in the 1st century, Pliny the Elder wrote that only a single stalk of silphium could be found, which was duly sent to Nero in Rome as a curiosity. After that, the historical record falls silent on any new harvests. Silphium's decline was likely gradual, tied to a combination of overuse and natural vulnerability. Most historians agree that overharvesting played a central role. Demand for silphium outstripped what the narrow fields of Cyrenaica could supply. Despite its popularity, and to make matters much worse, silphium stubbornly resisted domestication. Theophrastus, the naturalist and philosopher mentioned earlier, had noted centuries earlier that all attempts to cultivate silphium had failed, even in its native soil. Modern experts speculate it may have been a sterile hybrid, or required very specific environmental triggers to germinate, meaning it could only propagate in the wild under ideal conditions. Thus, unlike a crop that could be farmed, silphium had to be gathered from nature each season. Such reliance on wild stock is inherently precarious. Cyrene's administrators did try to regulate the harvest, and ancient records suggest that they tried to prevent the digging up of roots. But as silphium's fame and price grew, those conservation measures likely gave way to greed. Overzealous collectors may have pulled up too many plants, preventing regrowth. Grazing was another pressure. Shepherds knew that feeding silphium to their flocks was well accepted to enhance the flavor of meat. Animals grazed on silphium could thus be sold at a premium. When you're a North African subsistence farmer in classical antiquity, you don't have the luxury to worry about whether silphium will still be around in 25 years. This, combined with natural foraging by wild animals, further strained the plant's regeneration. Silphium's own biology might have also been its undoing. If it required a very particular habitat, one small slice of the Libyan coast, any change to that environment could tip it over the edge. As Cyrene prospered, its population grew, and with it came deforestation for timber and expanded farming in the surrounding hills. The once forested upland plateau helped capture moisture and create a microclimate suitable for silphium. But widespread tree loss and intensive agriculture would have led to soil erosion and desertification, diminishing the rainfall and winter frosts that silphium needed for germination. In essence, the local climate became drier and less hospitable to the plant, and by changing the land, people may have literally destroyed silphium's nursery. This is of course interesting, since this wild crop was one of the reasons the region was able to prosper so much anyway. The disappearance of silphium didn't go unnoticed in classical antiquity. People tried to find substitutes or claimed to spot remnant plants in out-of-the-way places. All that said, the substitutes, such as asafoetida, didn't match up according to contemporaries who had experienced the real McCoy. So-called remnant populations, which some claimed existed, either didn't exist in large enough quantity or didn't exist at all, given the plant dropped off from the historical record. By the medieval era, silphium became more legend than reality, referenced in old spice lists, even when no one had seen it in over 1,000 years. Today, silphium stands as both a fascinating historical mystery and a cautionary tale. Its story illustrates the fragility of even the most valued natural resources. The mystery of silphium is a reminder that no matter how important something is, we can lose it through mismanagement and neglect.